there's been a lot of scholars who've simply not fully understood Ahmed, and I mean it's a complex analytical framework, and we are so conditioned to think in terms of religion and these other kind of major categories. But as both you and he show, I mean these categories have gone through the deconstruction dojo. So
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us. Today we are going to be doing something really fun. It's kind of starting out a little series of some interviews with the contributors to the first issue of the new journal that's out, Metamodern Theory and Praxis, issue one. And the first contributor is actually the first author who has an article in this new issue, Jared Morningstar. And we're going to talk a little bit about Jared's piece in the journal. And get an opportunity to sort of go deeper into this awesome contribution of Jared's, and hopefully over the course of however many, I don't know, couple of weeks or into the future, get some insights and some voices on this channel from people who've contributed to this, and kind of shine a spotlight on the work that they're doing. So that's kind of what this will be about. I'll throw it over to you, Jason, if you have any other things you wanted to mention about this journal or your work or anything.
Yeah, so I assume some folks may float in here from not from the metamodern context, and for those of you who are just tuning in because of they know Jared and his work or interested in theorizing Islam or the Islamic. Just note that Metamodern Theory and Praxis is a brand new, cutting edge, anti-disciplinary journal that is bringing together this new and unfolding movement on a kind of no bullshit philosophy that some of us are calling metamodernism. And this is sort of for us a trial balloon, a lab rat. Jared has agreed to do the first of these, and I'm not exactly sure how it's going to go, but my hope is that it'll provide an opportunity for folks to get a sense of the article and the argument, and maybe whet your appetite to read it and other things in the issue of the journal. And I say this at the outset that a lot of academic scholarship is not only paywalled, which we're not doing, but second, it's just a PDF that somebody never reads, right? Like plenty of academic articles are never cited. And one of the things that Brendan and I were talking about that we could do as a value added in this journal was by having these kind of podcast interviews. It would be something informal about the article that might open it up to a broader audience who might not otherwise see it or engage with it. And so that's kind of what we wanted to do here. So
Yeah,
yeah.
awesome. Yeah, no, and we're at multiple fronts kind of trying to push, the kind of institutional bounds here a little bit in terms of, trying to put this really quality scholarship out into the world in maybe more creative ways. So this is sort of an example of that. But yeah, without any more ado, Jared Morningstar, thanks for joining us for a little chat about your article. Excellent article. I'll just cite it real quick. Titled "A Metamodern Paradigm for Islamic Studies Scholarship." Evaluating and extending Shahab Ahmed's theorization of Islam and the Islamic. And yeah, this kicks off the journal. Why don't you give us a sense of what you're trying to do with this piece and take us into it a little bit?
yeah, thanks for having me. Definitely excited to be in conversation with you both and explore this piece and some of the ideas that come out of it and broader topics in metamodern theory and Islamic studies methodologies here. So definitely my bread and butter. So yeah, since I'm talking Islamic stuff, I'll give a quick invocation here. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. 2023, I was reading some books, as I do as a weird para-academic hobbyist. And one of the big books I was reading was this, What is Islam? The Importance of Being Islamic by the late Shahab Ahmed. And shortly after that, I got a copy of Jason's Metamodernism book and was sort of reading these in parallel. And right away, some real synergies were jumping out to me in terms of what these projects were about and some of the stances they were taking, some of the ways they were looking at the state of existing scholarship. And I'm like, wow, this is really interesting. I feel like I really have my finger on a pulse here in terms of yeah, some turn in the humanities and the social sciences that these two scholars are really in touch with and trying to respond to and responding to in complementary, similar sorts of ways. So when the journal call came out, I decided to whip something together and try to elucidate some of these parallels and synergies a bit more and draw out some of the significance too in terms of yeah some of the specifics of both Jason's theory and Ahmed's theory, and how they might complement and kind of play together in interesting ways.
Yeah, awesome. And I also should have mentioned at the outset, which would be helpful contextualization for this, that you engage a lot and very deeply with the process thought tradition as well. So, of course, Jason's working with what he calls a process social ontology, and sort of the topic of process thought is one of the things that you foreground in this piece. So yeah, maybe unpack that a little bit. What were some of those connections that you were seeing, including around some of the process lines, and what were some of these cross pollinations between these sort of different paradigmatic approaches with similarities that you were trying to
Yeah.
identify?
Okay, but
Yeah,
before
so
we wait, before we do that, I think it
please.
would be useful to take one step back and just for those viewers who haven't read your article and or don't do Islamic studies, can you just give us a couple of short remarks about who Shahab Ahmed was and how he fits into Islamic studies,
Mhm.
and then we can go into and I think Brendan is exactly right that the process connection is what struck me as most important in the article. But just a little bit of contextualization on Ahmed. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So he was an Islamic studies professor. Unfortunately, passed away kind of in the prime of his career, but he certainly left a really impressive corpus nonetheless. So I'd say this book, "What is Islam?" Published posthumously, is probably his opus, and it's certainly a thick tome. And basically, what he's trying to do in this book is show the deficiencies of the various predominant methodologies and perspectives in this field of Islamic studies. So he goes through various approaches, such as viewing Islam as a religion, viewing Islam as orthodoxy, viewing Islam through this term of the Islamicate, which kind of distinguishes culture from religion, and in turn showing how these frameworks kind of fail to give a full account of various Islamic phenomena that, in his kind of historical account, are really central to societies of Muslims understanding themselves as doing things that are sort of Islamically meaningful. And as a kind of response to this disciplinary kind of crisis of some insufficient methodologies, he kind of works to rehabilitate Islam and Islamic as their own analytically meaningful categories. So rather than trying to fit Islam into these boxes of culture and religion and trying to do a generalizable analysis that way, simply view these Islamic phenomena as Islamic. And so as a result, he goes on to develop this very nuanced theorization of what Islam is, which he pins it as a hermeneutical engagement with revelation to Muhammad. And more specifically, he splits this up into text, pretext, and context. And so these are the sort of different modes of engagement with the revelation, text being something like the Quran itself, context being all kinds of Muslim hermeneutics, exegesis, various kinds of poetry, even. But then there's also this dimension of pretext, which is sort of the kind of prior, the given, that is itself kind of in conversation with the cosmology and theology of the Quran, but allows for this opening where, say, mysticism and rational philosophy can be pursued on kind of Islamic grounds on their own through this acknowledgement that, well, this revelation has a whence to it. It ingressed into the cosmos from somewhere, and that somewhere is accessible by reason, by illumination, in various ways. And so that too is kind of Islamically meaningful and ought to be considered as hermeneutically meaningful Islamic activity with or without engagement with the Quran itself or other kinds of prototypically religious sources. So yeah, this is kind of his project here, rehabilitating Islam, the Islamic as a meaningful analytical category itself, upon which Islamic studies scholarship ought to proceed, rather than these inherited sort of frameworks of culture, religion, etc. And also, though, he kind of renounces much more prototypically postmodern approaches that would say, oh, Islam is simply defined as whatever a Muslim actor does. And so he wants to give some analytical rigor and allow for real kind of discrimination that these kinds of postmodern frameworks really don't allow for. If anything, a Muslim does is automatically as much of a legitimate kind of source for Islamic authority. Well, it's very easy to slip into a relativism that doesn't allow for any kind of real import or productive generalization. So yeah, that's a little bit more of a outline of the project, and I can talk a bit more about how all those features kind of plug in well with some of the metamodern research paradigm too.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, feel free to. Like that would be the logical next place. And for me, I was thinking that coming into that through the process angle would be one way to go about that. Of course, you're involved with the Center for Process Studies and work there. And so you have a really rich engagement with the Whiteheadian tradition and sort of process thought more generally. And so yeah, maybe just say what you're trying to do in this article by bringing those traditions into conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, there's definitely a process element in Ahmed's work here. Right towards the end of his kind of tirade against all these failed methodologies, he starts to find some kind of nuggets that he will build upon in making his own theorization. And one of these nuggets is this idea of the process of hermeneutical engagement, which for him, prior scholars took in too limited of a direction by focusing on kind of orthodoxy making hermeneutical processes, whereas he wants to broaden this to all sorts of different kinds of meaning making and self-constituting sorts of hermeneutical processes. So that's the kind of process element there. The other sort of aspect that runs throughout his work is his insistence on viewing Islam as a human and historical phenomenon, which I sort of map to the language of a process social kind, where the process is the historical aspect and the human social. So there's a clear synergy there. So that's one of the main threads I try to pick up on, and then really looking at this theory of process social kinds and how that fits into Ahmed's approach of the human and historical phenomenon of Islam as this process of hermeneutical engagement, looking at these anchoring processes that Storm's work outlines.
I have a quick question on that actually. So, because there is this emphasis on the human and the historical, but at the same time, there's also this engagement with the pretext that almost seems to, I don't know if it just allows for or even privileges the idea that there's this sort of ontological other, that is sort of the locus of ingression, from the outside with the revelation or something like that. Is there a kind of a metaphysical commitment in Ahmed's work in this way that's sort of like that's a big aspect to it, or can it be done and approached entirely from the human and historical kind of an endo-naturalistic frame?
Yeah, so I mean, I certainly get the sense that Ahmed, on a personal level, subscribes to various sorts of Islamic philosophical metaphysics, theology, cosmology, and I mean that's a definitely important source in some of his theorizing here. But you can take this framework more agnostically. The main import here is that these Muslim philosophers and metaphysicians understood their own sort of work, their meaning making of and as Islam because of this aspect that he identifies as pretext. So you could sort of renounce this idea on a personal level that there's any kind of metaphysical plane or such from which revelation or other sources of illumination can sort of enter into the world and human consciousness. But nonetheless, this is the way that these Muslim thinkers themselves were understanding their own work and their lives here. So part of his project is trying to give a comprehensive Edic account of Islam, the sort of anthropologist account from the outside that nonetheless is pan-emic, so that a believing Muslim in all sorts of different positions in the tradition would nonetheless assent to, oh yes, this is an accurate kind of representation of Islam and what is Islamically meaningful to me. So trying to kind of bridge that typical kind of gap there in certain ways.
Yeah. I've got questions. I also feel free to jump in anytime you want, Jason, and throw anything into this mix. But one of the things that comes up for me that I thought was really interesting and an important part of this was sort of the way that this helps navigate sort of presumed normative framings for Islam of sort of, you talk about the wine drinking parties in the classical Islamic tradition and other forms of maybe Sufi mysticism and things that would have been outside certain juridical kinds of contexts of acceptance or something. And if we sort of normatively privilege certain kinds of orthodox framings over those others, then there's a kind of a division that's sort of like, well, this is genuinely Islamic, and then this is sort of non-Islamic or anti-Islamic or an aberration or something. And so this seems to be a really important thing to be able to somehow navigate coherently, because one also, wants to have some level of coherence where there is meaningful definition occurring. It can't just be everything, otherwise it's nothing. But then at the same time, you're trying to capture a very diverse set of phenomena under a label or a category, and hence a lot of the reason why the difficulty of that has historically led to some deconstruction and some sort of a lack of sort of productive answers that can allow us to do some generative research in this way. So yeah, maybe say a little bit more about that aspect of it, because I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, that's certainly a central part of the work here. Ahmed is insistent that Islam is exemplary in kind of having this aspect of coherent contradiction throughout the tradition. But a lot of these historical approaches in the scholarship try to kind of resolve this contradiction and collapse, say, the real Islam to the juridical authority, in which case Islamic wine drinking really does not kind of pass the test. But nonetheless, if you look at the accounts from history of these practices, it's clear that the folks involved were doing something that was spiritually meaningful, that was replete with Islamic symbolism. So there's a tension there that the kind of deficiency of the framework produces. One of the interesting ways that Ahmed frames this division of text, pretext, and context is calling it the spatialization of revelation. And I didn't have really time to get into too much of the details of that in the article, but part of the consequence of that that he identifies is certain striations of hierarchy and interiority, exteriority that have all these kinds of ramifications of creating different social spaces and different discursive registers within the tradition. And so this is sort of his approach to really giving an account of this coherent contradiction. Of course, there's contradictions when there's different levels of kind of discursive traditions within Islam that have their own registers, have their own kind of normative, own standards of normativity. The standard of the normativity of the Sufi poet is different because it is located differently in this matrix of the spatialization of revelation than is the normative authority of the jurist. But these are in relationship, of course. So this framework kind of allows for a mapping of the terrain here that nonetheless allows all these points on this matrix to be meaningfully understood through and as Islam, while kind of preserving their own sort of emic self-understanding in various ways. So certainly there's authority of the jurist, and it is as Islamically sort of grounded and valid as sort of other discursive traditions. But this framework of the spatialization of revelation allows us to not unduly privilege this due to, say, biases stemming from using this Eurocentric framework of religion to identify this kind of textualist, legalist engagement as the real stuff of what's going on, or the central stuff.
Yeah, I have actually an interesting little anecdote that relates to this. And I'd be curious to get both of your perspectives on it. Because Jason, a lot of your work, obviously, in this book, the Metamodernism Future of Theory book is about trying to trigger and maybe even sort of exemplify a paradigm shift for the human sciences. Which stands in contrast to the sort of dominant postmodern paradigm, which is sort of hanging out in the deconstruction space. So for example, my background's in religious studies, which I think all of ours is. So when I was doing my BA in religion, I took a class called Islam, like that this was sort of, like there's kind of a Christianity class and a Buddhism class, one of those kind of intro classes that serves to, serve to cover a lot of the material, whatever that is. But of course, then there's a kind of hermeneutical aspect that goes into, well, what is a curriculum or a syllabus for a class like that to look like? What should it look like? And we, at the time, I think at my university, didn't have I think maybe we just lost a professor and they were in the process of hiring a new one. So there was a visiting lecturer, and he taught this Islam course. And what was interesting about it was that we only wound up reading contemporary works of fiction by authors in the quote unquote Muslim world. So we never once cracked a Quran. We never talked about Hadith. We never talked about, and like any of the history in terms of the kind of geopolitical aspects. None of this got covered. I remember we read Moth Smoke. We read Snow by Orhan Pamuk, and I mean some interesting and good literature. But it raised this really interesting question about halfway through the semester. Someone's like, "Are we ever going to read the Quran in the Islam class?" And then the professor said, "Why would we do that?" And there was sort of this imposition or this expectation. I think kind of a challenging of expectations, right? Like, who's to say what Islam is, and who's to say that we should read this? But I mention all that both because in my mind, it kind of represents a lot of what the academy then becomes in the context of deconstruction. But also because I wonder if the syllabus material in that situation would have sort of counted in Ahmed's sort of, understanding, right? Because a lot of this material were novels that might come from that part of the world and might engage in some way with Islamic tradition just because it was part of the cultural milieu, but were otherwise, unrelated. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that by you and get kind of both your thoughts on that in terms of a kind of paradigmatic approach to this material and things. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, without being particularly familiar with any of the individual works you read, I think much of it likely would fit in Ahmed's schema of Islam as hermeneutical engagement along these different dimensions. But I mean, part of it is also it's hermeneutically meaningful for the self. So I mean, if these authors aren't really doing something kind of existentially vital in their kind of own meaning-making lives with the Islamic material, then it maybe isn't that act itself might not be Islamic for them. I give some examples in the article of, say, a non-Muslim scholar or mosque architect who's doing scholarship in Islamic studies or building this place of community and worship. And yeah, they're drawing on various aspects of Islamic tradition, but it might not be meaningful for them. So in such a case, these artifacts might be Islamic, as other Muslims might be kind of apprehending the Islamic dimensions to them, and thus then doing Islamically meaningful hermeneutic activity with them. But So yeah, definitely depends. Definitely depends. But I think what's really interesting in that anecdote is it was a very political decision to focus on contemporary, say, Arab slash Islamic literature rather than these quote unquote religious sources, these scriptural documents, these works of theology and law. Certainly in the post 9/11 environment where there's a lot of reactionary furor about Islamic jihad, extremism, etc. Yeah, in the academy, we saw a lot of these types of moves where it's like, oh, look at all these wonderful cultural productions of Muslims, like novels and such, and trying to shift this discourse to implicitly present Muslims in a more diverse and varied light beyond these media caricatures we saw of these sorts of extremist groups. And I mean, valuable project. I mean, there's a lot of reason to go about this sort of work. But Ahmed takes a different path, certainly. I mean, he would say that, for example, ISIS, Islamic terrorists generally they're Muslims and they're doing Islamic meaning making as well. Although their meaning making is very, very cloistered, very constrained, very deficient compared to the larger gamut of the Islamic tradition and all these rich modes of relating to Islam that one finds both in historical periods and, of course, contemporary periods. So I think ultimately his framework, in a similar way, perhaps to some of Jason's approaches to bringing out these value commitments, is like a little more honest about some of these things and through a much more analytically rigorous methodology here, doesn't do any kind of sleight of hands that might kind of raise some questions upon kind of critical reflection from someone who, say, might have a worry about fundamentalism, extremism in Islamic societies. The postmodern approach where it's just like, oh, look at all these cultural products, all this beautiful literature, all the diversity, doesn't allow you to actually really kind of tackle that question on an explicit level. But it warrants some real consideration because otherwise you kind of leave it to the more reactionary people to talk about these sorts of things, and that's certainly not what I want.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, no, I would add, exactly just sort of to underscore what Jared just said that, the study of Islam in definitely the post 9/11 world is heavily politicized. And so I think that there's often a pressure on Muslim scholars to adjudicate, or scholars of Islam to adjudicate what counts as authentic or inauthentic Islam in ways that are often either critiqued from the perspective of Islamophobic actors or are critiqued for other reasons. So I can see why, it can be very valuable for scholars to be able to kind of play with what counts as Islam and look at the plethora of different kinds of cultural productions and different ways that one might, engage with Islamic literature, as that course sounds like, I remember I did a course as an undergrad with Jamal Elias on Sufi Islam, and that was in the pre 9/11 era, because I'm just a little older than y'all, but that was when I was an undergrad, and already there was the presentation of Sufi, which had become a trope associated with both, on the one hand, a kind of Orientalist imaginary of the Sufi as this kind of universal mystic, but on the other hand, a critique that Sufi wasn't really Islam, it was something else. And so I remember in that course, Professor Elias was sort of navigating all these questions of a definition. And I think he ended up with, and I could be misremembering, but with doing a very common move at that time, which was simply a pluralization. There's not one Islam, there are many Islams, and then here's the one that we're looking at, or whatever, which sort of often doesn't answer the question. It just defers questions about boundary and debate. But I love that class. It was a hoot. And Professor Elias, or Jamal Elias, is a fascinating scholar. But anyway, yeah. The other thing I wanted to ask you, Jared, just to pivot back to the article for a second, but I think might help us also in clarifying its stakes, are that you were sort of not just intervening in Ahmed and seeing parallels between his work and mine, but also intervening in the reviews of Ahmed's work. And so, can you tell us a little bit about how What is Islam was received, and then how you were responding to these various reviews of that work as well? I would love to hear a little
Mhm.
more. You can, and feel free to put in stuff that you couldn't fit in the article, because I know
Sure.
it was short, and yeah, I'd be curious to hear more about that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this work has had an interesting reception history already. I mean, it was definitely a monumental publication when it came out, and spurred all the more so by the tragic passing of Ahmed. But there were a number of symposia centered exactly around the work, and there's been many reviews that have come out. There's been a lot of scholars who've simply not fully understood Ahmed, and I mean it's a complex analytical framework, and we are so conditioned to think in terms of religion and these other kind of major categories. But as both you and he show, I mean these categories have gone through the deconstruction dojo, so people who are kind of caught still using them are sort of bracketing a whole kind of theoretical quagmire that calls into question some of the approaches. But I mean, there's certainly some open questions, some deficiencies, perhaps, of this work. A major one that appears in a number of reviews is the lack of really substantive engagement with Shi'i sources. So this is definitely a pretty Sunni-centric text, and one could make the argument that the approach is kind of broad and flexible, dynamic enough that incorporating Shi'i sources as well doesn't meaningfully change the kind of the basics of the analytical framework itself. But there's certain kind of open questions, especially in terms of the boundaries of text, pretext, and context that Islam, or that Shahab Ahmed identifies here, that yeah do definitely shift or become called into question when one centers a more Shi'i perspective. I mean, another of the kind of major critical remarks is just how dismissive Ahmed was of these sort of other methodologies, other categories. He definitely does an excellent job deconstructing all these things, but then sort of fully sweeps that material aside to uh, introduce his own framework of Islam as its own kind of meaningful analytical category. But do we not still want to view religion, view orthodoxy, view culture as important analytical categories? And I think that's exactly where your work really kind of allows a helpful intervention here, where just as Islam can't properly be understood as some kind of essential concept, likewise, these other categories ought not be understood in that way. And these are all cross-cutting process social kinds that have their own anchoring processes and complex genealogies here. And once we take that sort of acknowledgement, I think it really opens the door to a much broader and more kind of multifaceted academic methodology here that can really take advantage of some of these historically deficient categories and methodologies under this new approach that is much more process oriented. So yeah, I think that's a major kind of aspect that some scholars have been critical of. Of course, you also find simply some responses to this work that are kind of coming from a much more confessionally Muslim standpoint, where, well, something like the widespread practices of Muslim wine drinking, you find people who just want to reject that and say, no, that isn't properly Islamic. So, but whether that is kind of a really a fully academic or more of a yeah, kind of confessional approach remains a little questionable. But nonetheless, there's many Muslim academic voices who have strong faith commitments, and those are intertwined. So.
Yeah, well, two thoughts. One quick is just, yeah, the idea of trying to find some panemic account that would, in a sense, try to make everyone happy in a sense, both panemic and etic approaches that, is that even like how feasible is that? Or at a certain point, are you going to start alienating people by what you include? And if you're not excluding certain things, et cetera. But what more came up for me a second ago was I'm intrigued by um, the way that maybe like process social kinds thinking can sort of, in a sense, generalize, it seems, what Ahmed is doing in this work. Because it sounds to me like by kind of landing on this notion of Islam as category, it almost sounds like he's trying to make this like this is its own sui generis sort of thing that, once you understand what it is, then you can apply it. But the thing that comes up for me about this is sort of like it seems like all the moves that he's making could also be applied to other religious traditions, right? So, if you replace the phrase, revelation to Muhammad with the ministry of Jesus Christ or something like that, right? Then you've got a really wonderful, helpful pretext, context, text situation that could allow you to do similar sorts of works in other traditions. And so, yeah, maybe what are your thoughts on that? Like, do you see process social ontology as being a bit of a wider umbrella to be able to do these sorts of moves?
Yeah, I think definitely so. The process approach is very helpful for being able to link things up together, but in ways that don't allow or don't fall prey to kind of collapsing into this sheer diversity, sheer relativism. I mean, it's a very interesting question to what extent Ahmed's theorization of Islam can be mapped to these other major traditions. Could you have the pretext, context, and text in Christianity? Maybe, maybe not. What kinds of tweaks would need to happen there to make that kind of a helpful framework? And likewise, Buddhism. I was kind of thinking, I was mulling this over a little bit prior to our discussion. It's like, well, Buddhism maybe seems like a very pretext heavy sort of tradition in a lot of ways, where it's so much these kind of meditative experiences that are sources of authority, sources of inspiration, generate context, all these treatises on technique in meditation, on states and stages. So yeah, I mean, it certainly sounds potentially very valuable, and that's maybe speaks to a certain extent to which the category of religion may nonetheless have something to say. I don't know if you could map pretext, context, and text to something like capitalism, for example, and have that be nearly comprehensible or analytically valuable. So yeah, being able to trace some of these anchoring processes and just the language of anchoring processes, I think is very helpful here. And mapping Ahmed's theory of hermeneutical engagement to various kinds of anchoring processes. Again, yeah, it helps substantiate some of this theorization and make it a little more translatable and generalizable, hopefully.
Yeah, well, speaking of specifically the returning to the notion of hermeneutical engagement, I also wanted to hit on this sort of touch point with your engagement with kind of a hylosemiotics relative to that, which comes in towards the end of the paper. Talk about the move that you're trying to make, drawing on that to elucidate some of Ahmed's thought.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, an interesting aspect here is, I mean, Ahmed draws on some semiotic theory in really kind of mapping out what he specifically means by this aspect of context. And particularly, he's working with this idea of a semiosphere, this kind of whole world of meaningful signs and signifiers that is coming out of some interesting work in this Tartu Moscow school of semiotics. So, I mean, something I didn't get to in this piece, but would be very interesting. And quite a tangent and perhaps something to explore down the line is yeah, seeing how this kind of Persian influenced hylosemiotics plays with some of this work that Ahmed is drawing on, and perhaps that has some ways that it might modify how he's understanding the context, in particular, broadening it out beyond the typical kind of anthropocentric readings of semiotic sign signifiers, to where, yeah, various things can be read semiotically, such as yeah, ritual acts, liturgical acts, but yeah, also the non-human world in various ways. And I mean, this connects then back to some of the ideas of text and pretext. I mean, certainly the Quran itself presents the cosmos, creation, our natural world as kind of semiotically rich, meaningful, as a text to be read in certain respects. And so, I mean, kind of within an Islamic perspective, taking a hylosemiotic viewpoint could be interesting for, yeah, mapping out some of the ways that text and pretext jump out as kind of meaningful signs and signifiers beyond just intentional human action.
Yeah, I don't know if while the author's present, if you want to say anything about hylosemiotics to give a little brief synopsis of what that is encompassing here to kind of link this to the notion of deepening and expanding semiotic readings of the world or anything, Jason.
Oh yeah, but can I do it in the 8 minutes we have left is the problem. But
Yeah.
I'll just say, in counter reaction to a Saussurean notion of linguistics that sees the world in the sign as totally bracketable. You bracket out the world, and you think of meaning in terms of merely a relationship between basically a particular manifestation of a sign, particular sign and a particular concept. What I was interested in is thinking about how the world itself could serve as a carrier for semiotics, or to put a little bit differently, how not just humans but other kinds of animals live in semioverses and in places in which worlds that are full of rich meaning. And building off of Persian semiotics and also some work by the Baltic German biologist Jakob von Uexküll, I was interested in thinking about how meaning is not merely a property of words, but for a tick, meaning could be found in the smell, the chemical smell that comes from an animal like a deer that it wants to jump onto. And so the tick, for instance, isn't trapped in a world, of language bracketed, in which meaning has been bracketed out, but actually lives in a world, an Umwelt, to use Uexküll's formulation, that is pregnant and full of meaning, but that is particularly, the tick is particularly attuned to. So it's both not a what older sort of analytic folks might think of as a pure reference or merely scientific cosmology, but one in which the tick is in an environment that it's constantly interpreting and responding to. So yeah, and I caught the. Anyway, that's part of what I was trying to do with hylosemiotics. There's a lot in the theory, but I was caught, Jared, in your reference to the semiosphere, which of course is from Yuri Lotman, and that whole broader tradition of sort of Russian semiotics. Anyway, there's a separate conversation there, but it's a quite different model, but it includes ways in which we generate a kind of ecosystem of signs around ourselves, whether you read it in purely cultural terms or in other ways. But yeah, so hylosemiotics was a way to think through meaning. What might we mean by meaning, and what might we mean by meaning if we de-anthropomorphize the human subject, and then start to think about how meaning functions on a continuum. Yeah. Anyway, so that's a short, a mini version of it. Yeah, but I was also curious to add, because you were started to gesture, Jared, at as toward future projects, and I thought maybe perhaps where do you see this leading you, either this particular article, or where do you see your work going, either your philosophical or artistic or other kinds of work going from here? Yeah.
I have my hands in a lot of buckets. I don't know if that's a real metaphor, but I'm doing a lot of stuff. I'm doing the process stuff for sure. And your work certainly links up with that, though more through the kind of John Dupre biology process lineage than kind of the Whiteheadian stuff that I'm more steeped in. I'd love to, yeah, do some more work kind of in linking those things up explicitly, adding some Whiteheadian insights to some of the process social ontology. I think there's definitely some valuable work to be done there. Yeah, in terms of the Islamic studies stuff, ultimately, what I'm most interested in, and where kind of a lot of the metamodern discourse comes in for me, is allowing for contemporary constructive work in Islamic philosophy, theology, metaphysics, etc., to really have kind of a dynamic responsiveness to all sorts of material. So, I mean, these already are living traditions. There are people doing, say, Mullah Sadra type scholarship in Islamic seminaries and such. But so often we're kind of stuck in this position of either kind of collapsing to, say, these much more kind of Western academic frameworks, or kind of maintaining a much more kind of confessional position within the tradition that isn't nearly as open to, say, philosophical, theological, etc. sources outside of, say, Sunni Islam or whatever. And I mean, there's a long history here of Islamic modernism, Islamic anti-modernism, and both those movements are deeply problematic in their own ways, both in terms of how they conceptualize the Islamic tradition itself and how they are relating with, say, science, contemporary philosophy, these sorts of things. So, I mean, if I could really put like a singular aspiration to some of the work I'm doing, it's to really kind of be in that intersection of living Islamic philosophy, etc., that's very cosmopolitan, very engaged with all kinds of world philosophical sources that are alive and dynamic right now, and nonetheless doing so from an authentically Islamic perspective that is drawing upon the riches of the tradition, but not viewing it as closed or entirely hermetically sealed, and all these sorts of things, which are very typical among any kinds of religious thinkers. Often that their own tradition is entirely self-sufficient, complete, has everything it needs. I think there's a grain of truth to that often, but especially in our era of pluralism and metacrisis and all these sorts of things. I can't help but feel that a thoroughgoingly cosmopolitan, multi-perspectival approach to these things within given traditions is deeply valuable. So that's where I'm trying to work.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And a question, big question, that comes up for me from that is, in our description of the journal, we say we're interested in work that originates in a decolonizing mode, engaging indigenous epistemologies and non-Eurocentric theoretical formulations. I'd just be curious if you see, with your familiarity with kind of how Islamic kind of studies have interacted in the academy, either with sort of, in Western frames, or modern or anti-modern kind of, engagements. Is there anything about the metamodern discourse or paradigm that you see as being somehow helpful for breaking up those kinds of impasses, or anything like that? Something unique about what might be afforded in this kind of paradigm that could kind of move the ball forward there at all?
Yeah, I think just the broadness and the kind of capaciousness of a metamodern perspective that nonetheless has some value commitments, explicitly has really grapples kind of metaphysically. I mean, I've had interesting experiences where I've sort of blogged some thoughts about the need for Islamic thinkers, as I was just saying, to both kind of revisit the riches of tradition while also grappling with novel sources of knowledge and thought. I had interesting responses to some of that where I was like called out by sort of deeply committed Muslims for having this kind of colonialist mindset that Muslim thought needs to progress, which isn't exactly what I was saying, certainly not how I would have framed it. But it's interesting how in a context where some of these commitments remain implicit and uh, you can get this kind of weaponization of decolonial, more postmodern type perspectives on a very kind of narrow-minded religious standpoint. So yeah, I think really it can help kind of navigate some of this space by being able to take things seriously, kind of on their own terms and navigate multi-perspectively without a kind of reductionism to sheer diversity, no directionality, no no acknowledgement of a purpose to say what one is doing, at least certainly not explicitly, or kind of regression to yeah, very narrow traditional religious approaches. So
Fascinating. Well, we're nearing the end of our time. Anything else, Jared, you would want to throw in about this particular article? Or yeah, I mean, I guess we already talked a little bit about the future of your work and your interests, but anything we didn't get to relative to this piece that you feel like you want to underscore?
Or anything that didn't get to fit in this piece that you
Mm,
wanted to also mention. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I definitely touched on some of that. I think looking at the semiotics, a bit more interesting research program there, looking at yeah how this spatialization theory might be able to map to other religious traditions, spiritual traditions, philosophic traditions. Yeah, I mean the process social kinds and the specific kind of anchoring processes, how Ahmed contributes to kind of further elucidating how these might work, how his approach kind of maps to some of your schemas for the anchoring processes. That's some pretty kind of nuanced stuff that's in the piece. So go read it if you want to hear more about the specifics of the process stuff there.
awesome. What about you, Jason? Anything else coming up for you through this conversation? Anything you want to add before we?
I know, I mean, I think it's really appropriate, though, that we started off with a work in religious studies, given our background and training. And I think the study of Islam has been one of the really pioneering subfields in the last 2 decades in the study of religion. It's definitely, I mean, especially post 9/11, where there's been a lot of controversies, but that often can make it a particularly vibrant subfield. And I was really psyched to have that put in dialogue. I mean, I think that this is, it's important stuff, and especially given, complex political instability in the Middle East and ongoing Islamophobia and all these other issues. I think it's really important work to be thinking about Islam and Islamic studies at our particular moment. So, and I wanted to thank Jared for letting us guinea pig this kind of interview format because we're still figuring out, what the best way to do it is. And I'm getting so much sunlight in my eyes. You probably can't quite see me here, but anyway,
Yeah.
yeah.
Looking luminous.
Yeah, I
So
guess
it's
I'm looking
apt.
inadvertently luminous. Right, indeed. Yeah. Maybe if I lean forward, the laptop will shadow my eyes. Anyway,
Yeah.
yeah, so thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, just to echo that. Thanks so much, Jared. Thanks for this piece. I think it kicks the journal off on a really solid footing, and you're doing some excellent scholarship, and you're just in the metamodern discourse space, a really important figure, and your perspective is really deeply appreciated. So thanks for taking the time to chat with us about this piece, and also just a call, I guess a call for papers, which is what we've got going on right now for issue number 2. I'll obviously have links in the description of this video, and maybe I'll put it on the screen or whatever if people are interested in this and then they want to submit something, as they're kind of increasingly getting a better sense of the sorts of things that we're looking for this journal. And Jared's piece, I think, really exemplifies that. So yeah, thank you both so much for your time. Really appreciate it. And till next time.
Thank you both.